Greetings, friends. A large number of very important events occurred today, so let's get started. Well, friends, if you've been watching our recent videos on the political side, we turned out to be right. And this evening, Zelensky officially dismissed Yermak, the shadow master of the entire Ukrainian state machine. His power was everywhere, and without him, Zelensky's affairs would have been much worse. This person also built a massive corruption machine in all spheres of the state in Ukraine. Now the internal situation has become much worse for Zelensky. Essentially, Zelensky's majority in the Rada has been lost. Many deputies will no longer vote according to direct orders from above. Of course, this didn't happen without American influence. It was the USA that pushed Nabu to act against Yermak and Zelensky's circle, having had compromising materials on them for several months already, as Tucker Carlson recently mentioned. We shouldn't harbor any illusions. American intelligence services knew perfectly well who Zelensky and Yermak were, all their schemes and so on. Trump has in his hands simply an enormous amount of opportunities to influence Ukraine and Zelensky, since the CIA and USA know everything about Ukraine, know everything about Ukrainian politicians, where their accounts are, have compromising materials on many, and so on. We'll continue monitoring what happens next in the political plane. Well then, let's move on to the line of combat contact, and we'll start with the Kherson sector. Today, information is coming in that local authorities of Kherson city have announced a covert evacuation, and sources familiar and close to the situation report that at the present moment, documents are being removed from Kherson territory, as well as various equipment, specifically documents of state enterprises. It's difficult to assume what this is connected with, but possibly it's related to the fact that the Russian Federation most likely has some plans for the Kherson sector as well. Next, we're moving toward the settlement of Zaporizhzhia and the Zaporizhzhia direction. A difficult situation continues to develop around the settlement of Hulyaipole. Today, additional details appeared regarding the breakthrough of Russian units from the east. Moreover, today the military command of the armed forces of Ukraine officially confirmed information that the Russian army managed to enter Hulyaipole territory, and all sources say this happened due to the fact that certain units of the 102nd Territorial Defense Brigade left their positions, most likely in the area of the settlements Zeleny High and Chervony, without warning their, let's say, units that were located nearby. Subsequently, this withdrawal led to the entire front line in this sector collapsing, and Russian units on the shoulders of the retreating Ukrainians jumped into the territory of the southeastern and eastern part of the settlement Hulyaipole. At the present moment, very heavy fighting is unfolding in this sector. Russian units are advancing, but based on the news coming in from this direction today, an impression is forming that Hulyaipole, most likely the majority of it, will fall in the very near future. Russian units will manage to establish themselves behind the Hulyaipole-Kharkiv defense line, and some part of Russian units will most likely begin moving along these strongpoints to strike Kharkiv from the northeast and east, precisely from that sector where this defense was essentially not prepared for such an offensive by the armed forces of Ukraine. On the other hand, Russian units continue to straighten the front line along the T-0815 R85 on the map. Highway, but so far without attempts to ford, or rather to cross and move further west of the highway, and without fording the Hulyaipole River. Various neutral cartographic services are reporting on this today. This is how the map looked as of November 26, 2025. By the end of November 27th, Russian units improved their positions east of Dobropilya and Vavarivka. And already by the end of November 28th, Russian units improved their positions essentially in the central part of Dobropilya. Based on this map configuration and statements from various sources, the Russian army already controls approximately 20% of this small village and is actively advancing further south toward the settlement Vavarivka. If we're talking about the Zaporizhzhia direction, then special attention at the present moment should most likely also be paid by us to a small square. This is the settlement Andriivka, Ostapovskoye, Danilivka, and Otradny. These four settlements, two of which are already under Russian army control, two of which are located along the Hulyaipole River and are under the control of the armed forces of Ukraine. Today, information also came in that Russian units managed to improve their positions slightly west of Otradny and advance slightly closer to the settlements Ostapovskoye and Andriivka. In reality, this front sector is a very important sector for the Russian army and for the Ukrainian army. The fact is that this Pokrovskoye-Hulyaipole line is what we've been calling the Zaporizhzhia Wall. Precisely that defense boundary where a large amount of remaining fragments of units is now being transferred in order to prevent a breakthrough of this sector. We've discussed repeatedly what will happen if this occurs. And if you look at the map, there are a large number of strongpoints between Hulyaipole, along the Hychul River and the highway. And all these strongpoints in some random way, let's say, end in the area of the settlement Pishchane. Then there's the settlement Bratskoye, Andriivka, Ostapovskoye, and further north already the Volcha River, and the settlement Alexandrovka and Pokrovskoye. That is, essentially a situation has developed when there's a small gap in strongpoints with a distance of 11 kilometers. And there's an extremely high probability that the Russian army will attempt to take advantage of, let's say, this window where a large number of strongpoints is absent, to bypass the main defense node of the armed forces of Ukraine located along the highway. And already from this side, from this bank of the Hychul River, Russian units can begin moving south, essentially without fording the river itself from east to west, precisely in the area of the main strongpoints. This is the settlement Radosne, Dobropilia, and Varvarivka. Here, slightly south of Pokrovskoye, very fierce battles may begin in the near future. And the goal of Russian units will be clear to us. It's unclear what Ukrainian formations plan to do with this situation. Next, we're moving to the Pokrovsk front sector. Today, from this direction, there are several important corrections. Pro-Ukrainian sources published video material from the area of the settlement Pokrovsk, from the area of the Hryshinka River. An FPV drone strike on Russian assault troops who are conducting clearing of these forest belts. Based on these frames, we made a small correction on the map in the northern part of the city. That is, we won't watch the video itself because there are scenes of violence present there, so we'll skip these frames. The most important thing is that there's video material confirming Russian advancement north of Pokrovsk with the aim of reaching Olympiyska Street from the south. Next, we're moving to the Kostiantynivka sector, to the Siversk sector, let's say. This is most likely already the Sloviansk sector. I remind you that yesterday the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation reported that the settlement Vasyukivka came under full control of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. And already today information is coming in that Russian units managed to enter the territory of the settlement Sviato-Pokrovskoye. This is how the map looked yesterday, November 27, 2025. Today, various cartographic services, including pro-Russian ones, report that the front line southwest of the settlement Siversk has collapsed. The Russian army forded the Bakhmutka River and took control of this strongpoint located along the T-0513 highway. In reality, this is a critically important advancement of Russian units. Yes, slightly north and northwest of the height, as well as AFU strongpoints along these heights. But if one strongpoint has already fallen, and also if Russian units manage to get a foothold in Sviato-Pokrovskoye, this tells us that one of the most important supply lines for the AFU has fallen away. We're talking about the T-0513 highway. This road was actively used by units of the armed forces of Ukraine for supplying the garrison through the settlement called Rai Alexandriivka. And now we see that if these corrections are confirmed by geolocations, or possibly by another report from the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation regarding the situation in Sviato-Pokrovskoye, then we can confidently say that this supply route no longer operates for AFU units. That is, essentially from this configuration, from this moment, the city of Siversk officially falls into semi-encirclement. Moreover, into such a semi-encirclement when the main roads are already under dense fire control. In the northwestern part of Siversk city, Russian FPV drone operators are actively working, trying to identify positions of the armed forces of Ukraine on which strikes are immediately delivered. Also, I'd like to remind you that yesterday the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, reported that as of the end of November 27th, the Russian army cleared 1,700 buildings on the territory of Siversk city. In total, on the territory of Siversk city, there are 8,000 buildings. That is, already more than 20% of the city is under the control of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. And overall, that map which we see, apparently plus or minus corresponds to that reality which is now happening in this direction. Siversk city is gradually falling into semi-encirclement, possibly even into encirclement. The northern part of the T-0513 road is also under dense fire control of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. Accordingly, to break through here, to drive through is also no longer possible. Next, we're moving to the Lyman front sector. From this direction, a large amount of various news is also coming in. We'll start with the fact that Russian units, according to a large number of independent experts, cleared an object called Varadero. Here there's a beach, some lake along the T-0513 road, apparently some former recreation base or something like that, and today's sources close to the situation, as well as those units that are currently working in this sector from the composition of the 25th Army, report that Russian units managed to completely clear this sector. This is how the map looked yesterday, November 27th. Today the map already looks like this. The Russian army is actively advancing, moving toward the settlement Dibrova. Regarding Dibrova, today already a number of experts, a number of cartographers, reported that the armed forces of the Russian Federation got a foothold in the settlement Dibrova in its northern part and are trying to consolidate now. The Ukrainian side is transferring reinforcements to this direction. However, everything that enters the action zone of FPV drone operators of the armed forces of the Russian Federation is immediately destroyed. In these frames, we see a series of strikes on reinforcements that were going from the side of the settlement Ozierne toward Dibrova. However, the reinforcements didn't even reach the village itself. Slightly north, combat operations continue for the settlement Lyman itself. The Russian army is gradually regrouping, pulling up fresh forces. Combat operations have been going on for several days already on the EU territory of the city, I remind you. From the Kupiansk direction, we're getting practically nothing for 24 hours already. I remind you that recently, the Russian Federation confirmed control over the city of Kupiansk. This was announced by the Chief of the General Staff, confirmed by the President of the Russian Federation. Apparently, at this moment, the main combat operations are unfolding on the Russian side of the Oskil River, along the perimeter of the settlements Kupiansk-Vuzlovyi, Kurylivka, Kucherivka, and Podoly. In the northeastern part of Kharkiv Oblast, the main events continue to unfold in the area of the settlements Vovchansk, as well as Vilcha and also Lyman. I remind you that yesterday, according to various cartographic services, advanced groups of the Russian army managed to enter the territory of Vilcha. At the present moment, clearing operations are ongoing here. At the same time, regular strikes are already being delivered along the very southern outskirts of this settlement. Regular strikes with the use of FABs, with the use of aviation, and we see that apparently combat operations, based on geolocation and coordinates of strikes, are shifting to the southern part of the settlement. And apparently in the near future, the Russian Ministry of Defense will confirm full control over this settlement, which is a critically important part of this entire direction, because after Vilcha, operational space opens up, and definitely the Russian army will begin its movement toward the settlement Bilyi Kolodez, which is one of the largest settlements south of the settlement Vovchansk. Well, and after Bilyi Kolodez begins Veliki Burluk itself, but most likely the Russian army will be moving toward Veliki Burluk from the side of Otradne and Dvorichanska. And that's everything, dear friends. Thank you for watching, subscribe to the channel, put your likes, and all the best to you.